This is Chapter 2, Example 1. In this example, we want to look at building a categorical frequency distribution, Pareto chart, and a pie graph. So in this case, we have a sample of Thunder Valley motorcycles is taken and their make is noted. And we'll see we have 5 different motorcycle manufacturers listed there, and then we have 20 pieces of data. Now, to make a correct categorical frequency distribution, all that means is we're going to put the data into a table with a specific format. And the format's pretty basic. It's going to have 2 columns. First column is going to be what the categories are. What do the different things mean? So in this case, that would be make or manufacturer or something of that idea, and then a list of those classes. The second column will be the frequency that matches up with each of those classes. So if we start looking at this particular example, in this case I had mentioned before, we're building a categorical frequency distribution. The reason it's categorical is, in this case our data is just names. It's not quantitative data like we had seen in Chapter 1, it's qualitative data. So the only thing we can do is look at the different classes and find the accompanying frequencies. So the first thing you want to do is typically try and get a list of your classes. So I look through this data and I see that there are 5 different manufacturers listed. Now, if there was a specific order to these things, if this data was ordinal, again referring back to one of the definitions we had in Chapter 1, then you would want to put your classes in that order. In this case, because these are all just different manufacturers, there's no inherent order. What we want to do, they could be in any order and it'd be correct. In this case, I chose alphabetical just because it made sense to me. Also, it eliminates the chance that I potentially put the same manufacturer in here in 2 different rows and don't realize it. So in this case, I take my first column, I put a header on it that makes sense. In this case, make. If you put manufacturer, that'd be fine. Brand, anything like that. Then list the different things. So we have Buell and Harley and Indian, Star, and Triumph. Once you've done that, now we need to figure out how often each of those classes is represented in the data. If you look in the book, they have some examples. One of the ways you could do it, is you start walking through the data and put little tick marks beside it. So Harley Davidson, put a tick mark beside it. Buell, put a tick mark beside it. Harley, put another tick mark beside the Harley. And walk through your data like that. Alternatively, you can just start going through the data and counting each one. In a small data set like this, I'd probably attack it like that. So when I'm looking at the Buells, I see a Buell here in the top row, a second one, and then a third one. So my frequency for Buells is 3. Harleys, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Harleys. So my frequency for it is 6. Indians, I only have a pair. 1 here in the top row, 1 in the bottom row. Stars, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. And then finally the Triumphs, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now once I have these 2 columns in the rows, I have built a categorical frequency distribution. Now, one of the things that is an option, not a requirement, but I highly recommend you do it, is this 20 down here. All this is I took and I added up the frequencies and got a total frequency. Now, the reason I suggest you do that, if you know how many pieces of data you have and you add up this column and it matches, that's a good sign. If you add them up and it doesn't match, you probably need to go look at your data because somewhere you have something out of whack, because this total frequency should match how many pieces of data you have. Alright, so that is the frequency distribution itself. Now, I discovered when I started to make this that I have an error in the examples document. I asked for a Pareto chart and I showed you a histogram. So I'll briefly talk about the histogram, and then I'll show you the Pareto chart, and I'll put that out online as well. In the case of a histogram or a Pareto chart, they're both basically vertical bar charts. But the histogram is a more open format. The Pareto chart has a special rule. So a Pareto chart is basically a special case of a histogram. So if we look at the histogram, all we did is on the horizontal axis, we listed each of the classes. So I listed Buell, Harley, Indian, Star, and Triumph. On the vertical axis, we're going to graph our frequency. So for the Buells, you'll see the bar height is 3. Harley, the bar height is 6. Indian, the bar height is 2. Star is 4. Triumph is 5. Now, a couple things here. Number one, in the book, they talk about making sure the bars touch. And I wouldn't worry about that. If you look here, I built this example on Excel, which is the most common tool. The bars don't touch. At the end of the day, you convey the same information whether your bars touch or not. So I wouldn't get too tangled up about that. Now, one thing that I do try to make a point of that I think is important, label your axes. If you look at a graph, one of the first things I look at when I look at a graph is what are the axes telling me? Because otherwise this graph is maybe just dropping things in out of the sky. I want to know what it's showing me. So I look at this and I have make here on the horizontal axis. And I have F or frequency or FREQ, something indicating that this is frequency on the vertical so that I know what it is. Okay, so the histogram is just a vertical bar chart and the order of the bars does not matter. In order to be a Pareto chart, the bars need to be in order from highest frequency to lowest, typically. Occasionally you'll see it the opposite direction, lowest to highest, but typically you'll see highest to lowest. So what I had done here, and I'll switch over to Excel, and as I said, I'll put this out on Blackboard when I'm done here. The Pareto chart, you'll notice that the items are in a different order. So now Harley Davidson is the first class, Triumph is second, Star is third, Buell is fourth, Indian is last. Still, I have the same marks on my axes. I labeled my axes the same way, although in this case I did spell out the word frequency. But the big difference is the bars are in order. Now, advantages to the bars being in order. If Triumph and Star had been at opposite ends of my histogram, they might have been very difficult to compare heights. But here, when they're side by side, it's much easier to tell which is the taller bar. An example of where you would use a Pareto chart is when you really want to draw attention to those first few bars. An example where I used a Pareto chart in the past, when I had done some work in a manufacturing company, and we were looking at scrap, and we built very expensive parts. Thousands and thousands of dollars a piece. So when we scrapped one, it was a very expensive undertaking. Every month they put out a scrap report and the causes of scrap. And we used a Pareto chart. What are the biggest drivers for why we scrapped things last month? And those are the ones that got the most attention. Okay, so the Pareto chart is a special case of a histogram. Now, the last thing then with this example is we want to build a pie graph. Now, to build a pie graph, what we're going to do is we need to figure out how big each wedge of the pie graph should be. So in this case, I'm starting out with my categorical frequency distribution. I've still got the column for the categories, got the columns for the frequencies. But now what I need to do is I need to add a column that shows what the proportion of the total each class represents, and then we're going to figure out how many degrees of a circle that is. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to take and figure out what proportion of the whole is represented by Buells. So in order to do that, we have a frequency of 3 for the Buells. The total frequency is 20. If we take 3 divided by 20, we get 0.15. Same thing for the Harleys. We have a frequency of 6 divided by 20 is 0.30. Now these are nice decimals because my total frequency is 20. It's terminating fairly quickly at 2 decimals. Typically, if you have an unusual, you don't have a nice round frequency here, you may probably want to go to 3 decimals. But these are cutting themselves off at 2. Indian, frequency of 2 divided by 20 is 0.1. Star, frequency of 4 divided by 20 is 0.20. And then Triumph, 5 divided by 20 is 0.25. Now, once you've done that, if you total this column, it doesn't want to highlight for me, if you total your proportion column, it should total 1. If you think about it, that should make sense. That should be the whole. So the proportion of all classes added up should total 1, or 100%. Because 1 is the decimal representation of 100%. So what we want to do is add those up. Now again, this case we add up perfectly to 100. If we had a total frequency, say here, of something like 37, this might not add up. We might be at 1.001, or we might be at 0.998. But within rounding, you should be right in the neighborhood of 1 if you've done everything properly. Now, once you have this column set, that figures out what proportion or what percentage of the total each class represents. Now we need to convert that to degrees. And in order to do that, we take advantage of the fact that we know that there are 360 degrees in a circle. So in this case, we take the 0.15 times 360, and we get 54. We take the 0.30 times 360, get 108. 0.10 times 360, get 36. 0.2 times 360, 72. 0.25 times 360, 90. Once you've done that, add up this column. In this case now, you should be totaling right around 360. Again, if we had a less nice total frequency, you'd have some decimals here. You might end up at 360.1. You might end up at 359.8. But again, you need to be right in that neighborhood of 360 within the range of rounding. So this concludes, and here is the pie graph for example 1, and done with Excel. So what you would need to do is just drop those into Excel and pick the pie graph. If you would want to build a histogram in Excel, it's actually a column chart. If you want to build a Pareto chart in Excel, it's also a column chart, but you need to do the sorting of the classes yourself first, and then graph the column chart, and so you have to do some of the heavy lifting yourself on that. This concludes example 1 of chapter 2.